You know, they've all had classified records, but no indictment. Yet now they're only going after President Trump. You know, it's a totally different story whenever it's President Trump. How are they going to even justify this? The documents that Joe Biden had, he wasn't protected by the Presidential Records Act. That all, you know, predates this.
President Trump is being singled out for basically two reasons, and you and I know them. He's running for president and he's winning. And if either of those weren't the case, then we wouldn't be here.
Joining us now is the terrific Matt Gaetz.
I'm sitting here with my father. I will make certain that between the man sitting next to me and every person he knows and my ability to forever hold a grudge, that you will regret not following my direction. I am sitting here waiting for the call with my father. Sounds like a shakedown, doesn't it, Director?
I'm not going to get into commenting on that.
You seem deeply uncurious about it, don't you? Almost suspiciously uncurious. Are you protecting the Bidens?
Absolutely not. The FBI does not and has no interest in
You won't answer the question about whether or not that's a shakedown, and everybody knows why you won't answer it. Because to the millions of people who will see this, they know it is. And your inability to acknowledge that is deeply revealing about you.
Here, I wanted to showcase to the country that Christopher Wray's unwillingness to acknowledge an obvious shakedown in front of the entire country is reflective of what we see at the FBI. They target conservatives, they go after President Trump and anyone who supports him, and then when there's derogatory information that comes in from reliable sources that have helped build dozens of other cases for the FBI, well, they just label all of that foreign interference so that they can continue with the grift.
How many illegal FISA queries have occurred under your leadership of the FBI?
Well, there are reports that have come out with different numbers about compliance incidents.
More than 1 million illegal ones? Because that's what the Inspector General said. The Inspector General said that in the 3.4 million of these queries, more than 1 million were in error. Do you have any basis to disagree with that assessment by the Inspector General?
I'm not sure actually that's a correct characterization of the Inspector General's findings on that.
Well, the internet will remind you of that in moments. But let's now go to what the court said. The court said it was over 200,000 that have occurred on your watch. Do you have any basis to disagree with that assessment?
Again, I don't have the numbers I sit here right now. What I can
Seems like a number you should know. How many times the FBI's breaking the law under your watch, especially if it's like over 1 million, to not know that number? And I'm worried about your veracity on the subject as well. Play the video.
After we expose the bias and the political capture that's occurred at the FBI, we can't just continue business as usual. That's why in the appropriations process that is coming up in a matter of weeks, we have to take a hatchet to the FBI budget and to the FBI authorities that have been weaponized against the people. Like, the Bidens are one thing, but it's the rest of us that they're still coming for. In the period of time that the Inspector General looked at the FBI's surveillance authorities, they were conducting 38 illegal queries every hour. And a judge who reviewed their conduct was particularly aggrieved that they were doing weird personal things like looking up themselves and their ex-lovers in the process.
The FBI has broken so bad that people can go and engage in queries that when you come before the Congress to answer questions, you're like blissfully ignorant. You're blissfully ignorant as to the unlawful queries. You're blissfully ignorant as to the Biden shakedown regime. And it just seems like it gets into a kind of a creepy place as well. Go to our next image on what the court said. Like, just so the American people realize, the court has smacked you down, ruling FBI personnel apparently conducted queries for improper personal reasons. People were looking themselves up. They were looking their ex-lovers up. Who has been held accountable or fired as a consequence of the FBI using the FISA process as their, like, creepy personal snoop machine?
There have been instances in which individuals have had disciplinary action and who are no longer with it. I can't get into it here, but we can follow back up with it.
But don't you see that that's kind of the thing, Director Wray, that you preside over the FBI that has the lowest level of trust in the FBI's history. People trusted the FBI more when J. Edgar Hoover was running the place than when you are. And the reason is because you don't give straight answers. You give answers that later a court deems aren't true. And then at the end of the day, you won't criticize an obvious shakedown when it's directly in front of us. And it appears as though you're whitewashing the conduct of corrupt people.
This is not an FBI anymore that singularly investigates crimes and holds people accountable. They've become the enforcement wing of the Democratic Party politically, and then they've just become unconstitutionally nosy with authorities that we have to constrain under the law. There's an arrogance to the tone of Christopher Wray that predominates the entire energy of these exchanges.
In your home state of Florida, the number of people applying to come work for us and devote their lives working for us is up over 100%.
We're deeply proud of them, and they deserve better than you.
Time of the gentleman has expired.
There's some selective amnesia there that's pretty apparent, but the one data point that Christopher Wray knew with particularity is he had some comeback to me where he said, well, Mr. Gaetz, all your criticisms of the FBI are not well-founded because we've seen a big increase in recruiting in the state of Florida. Now, so it's funny that, like, when you ask Director Wray, how many times has the FISA law been violated while you've been director? Well, he has no idea about those numbers. But then when he thinks it's something to jam me on a rhetorical point, he's got a memory that is quite lucid. So I think that the country saw the absurdity of that.
Again, I just can't speak to that here. I'm not an expert. I'm not sure yet. I would really have to see more closely. I'm not sure that I can give you that number. I can't get into. I'm not aware of any such evidence. I'm not going to speak to that. I'll decline to comment further. I will work with the department to make sure we can figure out what information we can provide. Again, I'm not going to get into that here. Well, again, I don't want to speculate about. I can't speak to the specifics.
One of the things we fought for in January was a specific rule that allows us to zero out specific bureaucrat salaries. If we don't use that rule regarding the people at the FBI, then that was an unserious endeavor because they deeply deserve it. But I think there's also a potential criminal referral here for Wray to the Department of Justice, which they will, of course, ignore, but I think that highlights the hypocrisy ever more. Christopher Wray said that the FBI never investigated parent speech at school board meetings. That was a lie. We had FBI whistleblower Steve Friend give sworn testimony before the committee that he was taken off of child porn cases and exploitation cases, and he was moved to go to a parking lot at a school board meeting and record people's license plate information so that that could be cross-referenced with other databases. Steve Friend, that FBI agent, had previously gone to school board meetings as a parent to express concerns about curriculum, and so he can give that testimony. I think that Director Wray was not honest with us. He also wasn't honest with Senator Lee several years ago when he said that there was none of the FISA spying authority used against people who were in Washington, D.C. on January 6th.
I don't believe FISA is remotely implicated in our investigation.
A federal judge issued an order essentially saying that that was a lie. So we have repeated lies. If we don't enforce the powers of contempt, if we don't send referrals, even though we know what Merrick Garland will do with them, then we are not protecting our Article I powers in the Constitution as the United States Congress. So those are some forward-looking, very aggressive approaches, but I think that the times we're living in and what we're seeing would call for them to be utilized. You and I both know nothing ever really happens in this town without presidential leadership. Sure. Presidential leadership drives anything that is consequential. And when we look at the consequential fights we're in, we know that with President Trump, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We don't have to imagine what his policies will be. We saw them on the border. They worked. We saw them in the economy. We were thriving. And I think people want to get back to that. And maybe now I would speak to those viewers who maybe you don't like President Trump. Maybe you don't like the mean tweets. Maybe you don't like the brash attitude. But even if you don't like it, you need it. You need it for the sake of your family and your job and your future and your country. And that is, I think, what is going to really define the contours of this race. And I think it's why you see Jack Smith engaging in these very aggressive actions. And for Joe Biden to be cast in the world now as a guy trying to jail his primary political rival, it undermines our nation going forward. And frankly, I think the stain's going to be pretty hard to get out. I mean, even after Joe Biden is a distant memory, I think that Despots and dictators throughout the world for 20 years may point to this action by Joe Biden to justify really brutal actions against political opponents and really terrible endeavors of repression, and that blood will be on Joe Biden's hands.
Yeah.